At the entrance to Disneyland stands a quote from Walt Disney. "Here you leave today and enter the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy." As a theme park dedicated to transporting visitors to all manner of worlds based on the imaginations of Walt and generations of creators, it's easy to get sucked into an idealistic, even purposefully naive vision of the past, or a romantic notion of pure fantasy. But it's the tomorrow of it all that's the sticking point, and a challenge that seems to have continually stumped Disney parks and their Imagineers for decades. Yes, we're talking about Tomorrowland, a section of Disneyland, Walt Disney World, and Disney theme parks around the globe. A land that, upon opening in 1955, was declared by Disney to be
a vista into a world of wondrous ideas, signifying man's achievement, a step into the future, with predictions of constructive things to come.
Now, 65 years later, Tomorrowland is not so much about predicting the future of the world, or America if we're being specific, but more so emulating where we'd rather be than right now. It's also the land that's been reinvented the most out of every land in any park, constantly updating its aesthetics and ripping out countless attractions to make room for new visions in an effort to keep its ideas of the future in step with the present. It's the constant challenge to solve what many have deemed the Tomorrowland problem. That's led to some classic additions and some rather unfortunate changes in direction, but we'll get to 1998 Diarrhea Disneyland later. If you follow the ever-changing presentation of Tomorrowland over the years, you'll see a theme park and a company as a whole in turmoil and triumph, going through all manner of changes in creative direction and management. And each time, it's Tomorrowland that bears the most visible marks of this continual change. During its design in the early 1950s, Walt's vision for Tomorrowland was to bring visitors into a future made possible through innovation, and we can see in his original prospectus for the area, which was then called the World of Tomorrow, that Disney had ambitions that weren't realized by the park's opening. A moving sidewalk, a mechanical brain, a diving bell, voice command opening automatic doors, even conveyor belts carrying your food through an instant cooking machine. Walt's big ideas simply did not happen with the original Tomorrowland. Fun fact, Disney producer Ward Kimball consulted Wernher von Braun and several other rocket scientists for the original design of Tomorrowland. As you may know, von Braun was a Nazi rocket engineer whose works were responsible for the deaths of thousands, and who was moved to the United States space program after World War II as part of the covert Operation Paperclip. So Disneyland actually has direct ties to Nazi Germany. It also meant that Walt Disney's vision for Tomorrowland was directly adjacent to America's vision for space travel, and deeply rooted in the atomic age in both its ideas about the future and its aesthetic presentation, reflecting the concurrent American X-15 program and subsequent Project Mercury. Like much of what's quietly embedded into the fabric of Disneyland, there's an air of American exceptionalism to Tomorrowland, and you can see it in the various attractions found throughout the area. But that vision took decades to form. For the first, and far from the last, time, Tomorrowland's construction was marred by budget cuts. The creation of Disneyland is now famously known as being rushed, with Tomorrowland as the last and most rushed of the original lands. With finances lacking, the area became a corporate showcase, with the Monsanto Company, American Motors, Richfield Oil, and Dutch Boy Paint each having showcases during the first few years of the park. Tomorrowland was lacking in attractions, originally containing Autopia, the TWA Moonliner, and a walkthrough of set pieces from the recently released 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Soon after, Disney debuted more attractions, including the Tomorrowland boats, the monorail, the World Beneath Us, the Flight Circle, and the Aluminum Hall of Fame. 1957 also saw the opening of the Viewliner, billed as the fastest miniature train in the world, but what's actually hailed as the shortest-lived Disney attraction ever, closing the next year. All of these were in service to envisioning a prospective future then set in 1986, the return of Halley's Comet. And it should come as no surprise that a 50s vision of the future, despite being extremely my aesthetic, had quickly become dated. This led to most of Tomorrowland being completely demolished in 1967 to make way for the new Tomorrowland in its World on the Move theme, built around atomic age Southern California specific Googie architecture, even more my aesthetic, and new attractions including the Carousel of Progress, Adventure Through Inner Space, Flight to the Moon, and the People Mover. By this point, you shouldn't be surprised that none of those rides are still there. Each of these new Tomorrowland rides, just like the ones that launched the land a decade prior, are focused on the then relevant ideas of how to innovate for the public's advancement. Space travel, submarines, the freeway, the monorail, and nuclear power. These elements provided what critic Rainer Banham described as the illicit pleasures of mobility. Ensconced in a sea of giant parking lots in a city devoted to the automobile, Disneyland provides transportation that doesn't exist outside. Steam trains, monorails, people movers, tram trains, travelators, ropeways, not to mention pure transport fantasies. It would be easy to fill this video with simply a list of all the rides that have come and gone from Tomorrowland, but whether they're the Crane Company Bathroom of Tomorrow in the Disneyland of the 50s, or the simply far too terrifying extraterrestrial alien encounter in the Disney World of the 90s, the fact is that Tomorrowland is a meat grinder of attractions, constantly spitting out new rides to envision a future that current technology is continually passing. Tomorrowland had always been first and foremost Walt Disney's vision for the future, and while Disney himself was heavily invested in the 1967 revamp, his futurism was primarily given an avenue through the
Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow,
or Epcot in Florida. In Walt's mind, Epcot would be home to 20,000 people, all living in a model society that he viewed to be a solution to urban crisis. In some ways, Tomorrowland was a dry run for the technology that would support Epcot. Monorails, people movers, combining with experimental architecture demoed in the land as well as recent World's Fairs. Walt's death in 1966, combined with Florida legislation not wanting Disney to build their own massive private community, kept the Epcot of Walt Disney's imagination from coming true, probably for the best. Residents would be required to move out every year to prevent them from gaining voting power. While a new theme park version of Epcot would be built in 1982, the death of Walt and the failure of Epcot can be seen as the last gasps of Disney's attempts at real-world futurism. When the Tomorrowland of Disney World opened in 1971, it was even more barren than the original, containing only 2 rides and a lot of empty space. It would, of course, be the subject of constant new additions which would invariably be ripped out in an effort to solve the continual Tomorrowland problem, but one ride would remain, Space Mountain, which was added to Disney World in 1975 and quickly replicated in Disneyland in 1977. And it's Space Mountain that remains one of the eternally popular Disneyland rides. It's also the ride which perhaps bears the most aesthetic overhauls of any Disneyland ride, changing sponsors over the years, given a new surf rock score in 1996, given a sickening bronze repaint in 1997, closed for a complete track replacement from 2003 to 2005, rescored by Michael Giacchinno in 2005, temporarily turned into Rockin' Space Mountain with a Red Hot Chili Peppers song in 2006, given the Halloween seasonal retheming of Ghost Galaxy starting in 2009, and turned into the Star Wars-themed Hyperspace Mountain in 2015. And as Disney continued to change, we can see that Tomorrowland permanently shifted from being a place that attempted to predict and shape the future, to being a place simply comfortable with feeling futuristic. In this way, Tomorrowland has become more in step with Disneyland and Disney World as a whole, a place that evokes a feeling above all, and in doing so, is untethered from reality, and instead implies the notion of reality. In his 1988 book Simulations, French theorist Jean Baudrillard said, "Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America that is Disneyland. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyperreal order and to the order of simulation." Despite once being a land whose corporate-sponsored ideas seemed ludicrous in retrospect, the original Tomorrowland vision was once an attempt to stay in tune with reality, but the cost of continual, real-time speculative innovation is simply too much for a theme park meant to entertain first and foremost. And there's perhaps no better example of Disney fully and truly moving away from reality and into a simulation of nostalgia than its mid-90s renovation. Beginning in 1995, Disneyland began closing longtime attractions including the People Mover, the Rocket Jets, and Mission to Mars for a major overhaul known as Tomorrowland 2055. Once again flung into the future, 2055 would be a thriving spaceport based on ancient powerful crystals that allowed the Earth to connect with aliens from across the cosmos. Plans were developed for years alongside the opening of then CEO Michael Eisner's brainchild of Disneyland Paris, and the new Tomorrowland revamp in Disney World. World. And while the Orlando Tomorrowland was successfully overhauled into a science fiction spaceport in 1994, the utter financial disaster of Disneyland Paris caused Disneyland's Tomorrowland 2055 to be completely scrapped. But Tomorrowland still needed a makeover. So Eisner and then Disneyland president Paul Presley decided it should simply ape the aesthetic of Discoveryland in Paris. The only problem was that the refurbishment needed to be done as cheap as possible. Tomorrowland was then covered in rusty bronzes, golds, and dark browns. But instead of looking like a retro-futurist vision, it just looked like someone forgot the weatherproofing on their still-standing Googie architecture. And lest we forget the ride that Disney so desperately wants to erase from our memory, the rocket rods became the ultra-fast replacement for the People Mover, blazing overhead and through multiple attractions in the area. That is, they would if the ride would ever stop breaking down. The rocket rods might be the greatest failure in Disney Parks history. Budget cuts and an inability to find a sponsor prevented Disney from being able to heavily modify the existing People Mover track for the now fast-paced ride, causing major limitations that quickly compromised the elevated support structure. The rocket rods were closed after only 2 years of off-and-on operation, and the barren, elevated track still stands in Tomorrowland, obscured by Disney's refurbishments and repurposing of its various buildings. The new Tomorrowland of 1998 was a faceplant that was essentially undone in 2003 when Matt Ouimet became the president of the Disneyland Resort, restoring Tomorrowland to a more classic aesthetic, but without the focus on innovation. It was the permanent move away from futurism and toward a simply futuristic feeling. You see, Tomorrowland is science fiction adjacent. Really, it's the experience of science fiction without the lessons that attracted the most important creators to the genre. It's all concept, no moral. But then again, what are we really supposed to learn from a 3-minute roller coaster? As Arthur C. Clarke once said, science fiction is something that could happen, but usually you wouldn't want it to. Fantasy is something that couldn't happen, though often you only wish that it could. Disneyland, by its nature, is designed to place you in a world you wish would be true. Any vision that goes against this, see once again the short-lived and horrifying extraterrestrial, isn't long for Disney. That also means the science fiction hypotheses of Tomorrowland can't grapple with the true ideas of progress. Instead, they must be transposed to science fantasy. And what screams science fantasy more than... While Star Wars had a foothold in Tomorrowland for years with the Star Tours attraction, it wasn't until Disney bought Lucasfilm and the franchise in 2012 that Star Wars became a major selling point of Disneyland. And since building an entire Star Wars section of your theme park takes time, Tomorrowland became faux Star Wars land in the interim. Star Tours was modernized, the aforementioned Hyperspace Mountain opened, and Star Wars characters filled the area. While Star Wars Galaxy's Edge was opened in both Disneyland and Disney World in 2019, Star Wars still maintains a major presence in Tomorrowland. Because without a massively famous established franchise holding together this hodgepodge vision of an incoherent future, what is Tomorrowland today, really? And no, the box office bomb of Brad Bird's Tomorrowland movie didn't help. It just got TRON 3 cancelled. Still mad about that. Tomorrowland is a strange, fascinating descent into what it means to not only entertain the masses, but establish your brand as a futurist without actually being a futurist. Walt Disney founded Disneyland as a place for imagination to run free, and while Disney and his many different companies were futurists to some degree in the creation of feature-length animation, the global saturation of theme parks, and the worldwide takeover of the media, what technology have they truly created to advance civilization? Tomorrowland is an aping of NASA with a carnival barker's appeal to the child in us. While early attractions were meant to fulfill Walt's vision of what the future held, while still hawking Monsanto products to the kiddos, Tomorrowland slowly shifted away from pointing toward the future, and instead letting us pretend we were already there. But each person's vision of the future is inevitably different. The experience of Disney parks is to consolidate those many different notions into a singular vision guided by the manufactured sights, sounds, smells, and feels being carefully produced all around you. In his essay, See You in Disneyland, architect Michael Sorkin wrote, "At Disneyland, one is constantly poised in a condition of becoming, always someplace that is like someplace else. One has gone nowhere in spite of the equivalent ease of going somewhere. One has preferred the simulation to reality." For millions of visitors, Disneyland is just like the world, only better. The appeal of Disney parks is to transport visitors to not only another world, but the era in which each ride was created. The nostalgia of decades-old Imagineering goes hand in hand with the nostalgia baked into the stories chosen to be told by Disney, which is why Tomorrowland is such an oddity. It must both envision the future and remind us of the past. If the goal of Disneyland is to create a simulation that forcefully aligns the visitor's perceptions with that of the corporation, then Tomorrowland is an experience of having one's perceptions aligned with everything and nothing at all. Instead of being transported into the future we'd hope to get to someday, we are reminded of everything from our past that made us feel far into tomorrow. It's all simulation, but simulations constantly out of sync with one another. And if we travel once again back to Walt Disney's original vision for Tomorrowland, we see it as pure simulation too. Not just simulation of the future, but simulation of one civilization indivisible under mouse. The truth is that we're never really able to grasp the future we want to be in, but we're also never able to be back in the past we've become nostalgic for. Instead, we're simply caught in the here and now, wishing we'd be somewhere else. And even right now, we're not able to go to Disneyland without the fear that our very present moment instills upon us. A man tells you that the future you see in front of you will be real someday. And suddenly, that future fills your mind with possibilities that can only exist in the smallest of places. Tell me, 65 years later, where is that future? Thanks for watching today's video. I know this video is a little out of the ordinary in what it's talking about, but I'd been wanting to cover another theme park ride since I covered the Haunted Mansion last year. And so I was thinking about a lot of different subjects for this video, and originally this was just going to be a coverage of Space Mountain's history through the years and in the different parks. And so while I was researching Space Mountain and beginning to write this essay, I realized that I wanted to really talk about Tomorrowland as a whole. And I find its history and all its changes to be really fascinating, and I think it's emblematic of Disney as a whole. Also, one of my earliest memories of being at Disneyland is actually of being at Tomorrowland. I remember this very vividly. As a kid, my parents took me to Disneyland, and this is when the rocket jets were still there. And to get to the rocket jets, which were on a second level, you had to go up an elevator. It was kind of like a freight lift. And I don't know how old I was, maybe 5 or so, but we got into the elevator, and I stuck my hand out, and my thumb got caught in the closing elevator doors. And it sliced my thumb open, and I was bleeding everywhere and crying and screaming. And so we went up to the rocket jets, and my dad insisted that we still needed to go on the ride because we'd been waiting in line. I don't know how long we'd been waiting in line, but we'd been waiting in line, and he decided we were going on this ride. And I'm screaming and I'm crying and I'm bleeding. And I have this very vivid memory of being in the rocket jet, which is this open capsule type of ride, and you're spinning around the center of the ride. And I'm looking down, and my dad has taken his white t-shirt and he's wrapped up my thumb in it. And I am bleeding through this white t-shirt. And I out of the corner of my eyes, I'm seeing sort of the ground and the sky and everything kind of whiz by as we're going around the circle. And I'm still crying, and I'm still screaming, and I'm really upset. And we went on the ride, bloody thumb and all, and my dad, I guess, walked around Disneyland for the rest of the day with a big blood stain on in the front of his white t-shirt. I guess he was a really big fan of the rocket jets. Anyway, that's my first memory of Tomorrowland, and maybe it's made me bitter toward the land now that I'm thinking about it in retrospect. I don't know, but I had a lot of fun talking about Tomorrowland as a whole, and I hope that you enjoyed it too. As always, thanks to my patrons for continuing to support me, and thank you all for continuing to watch the videos. I'll be back again soon, and we're going straight into the Halloween season, so expect lots of spooky videos. See you again soon.